All right, so today we're diving into something pretty big for those of you prepping for the UPSC.
Definitely a hot topic.
Yeah, we're talking about the Arunachal Pradesh Freedom of Religion Act of 1978.
Passed and then kind of forgotten for like almost 50 years.
Right, just kind of sat there.
And now it's back with a vengeance.
Big time. So
Huge implications.
exactly. And you know what's so interesting to me is how this act, it seems like a local thing, right?
Yeah, on the surface, very much so.
But it really reflects like a much bigger issue playing out all across India.
Definitely, and globally, too.
Yeah. How do you balance protecting individual religious freedom with preserving these like unique cultural traditions?
Especially when those traditions are so intertwined with spiritual beliefs, you know?
It's like they're woven together.
Yeah, it's not a simple separation.
Not at all. So to understand why this is happening now, let's rewind a bit.
Okay, let's go back in time.
Back to the 1950s when Christianity started to spread in Arunachal Pradesh.
And it's interesting because it wasn't as early as other northeastern states.
Right, because Arunachal was pretty isolated.
Yeah, geography played a role there, and colonial history, too, kind of kept it a bit separate.
But by 1957, the first church was established.
And things started to change.
And those changes, they sparked concern, right?
Oh, yeah, big time.
Because Arunachal Pradesh has like a ton of indigenous beliefs.
It's a melting pot, really. Mahayana and Theravada Buddhism, Dhanipola worship, and so many more.
Wow, it's like a tapestry of cultures.
Exactly, and each with their own spiritual practices.
So the arrival of Christianity, it kind of made people anxious.
Yeah, there were worries about the impact on these existing cultures.
Especially for certain tribes, right?
Yeah, the Adinakte and Nishi tribes in particular.
Where conversions were happening and people started asking questions.
Like, what does this mean for the future of their traditions?
Big questions. And that debate, that's what led to the 1978 Act.
It all played out in the Arunachal Pradesh Assembly.
So this act, was it specifically targeting Christianity?
Well, not explicitly, no. The Arunachal Pradesh Freedom of Religion Act of 1978, it aimed to prohibit forced conversions.
Okay, so any religion.
Yeah, it didn't single out any one faith.
Interesting.
It defined force as like coercion, enticement, or any kind of trickery.
So basically manipulating someone to change their faith.
Right, and the penalties were serious.
Like what we talked.
Up to 2 years in prison and a 10,000 fine.
Wow, that's...
Which back then was a lot of money.
Yeah, no joke.
They even had a clause about reporting all conversions to the deputy commissioner.
Oh, wow. So like keeping tabs on everything?
Yeah, with more penalties if you didn't comply.
Sounds pretty intense, but if it was passed in 1978, why are we just talking about it now?
That's the mystery, isn't it?
Almost 50 years later.
It was basically dormant for 46 years.
Why, though?
Because it lacked those like nitty-gritty implementation rules.
So like a car with no engine?
Exactly. The law was there, but nobody knew how to actually make it go.
Okay, a law without teeth?
Correct.
But somebody must have wanted to give it those teeth eventually, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. There were some key players who wanted to see this act enforced.
Who are we talking about?
Well, first you have Christian groups like the Arunachal Christian Forum.
Formed right after the act.
Just a year later in 1979.
Wow, so they were on it.
They argued that this law was biased against Christians.
Makes sense. They were a growing part of the population.
Exactly. And they felt it would be too easy to misuse the act.
To target converts.
Yeah, to harass them, essentially.
And from a political standpoint, alienating Christian voters.
Who made up over 30% of the state by the 2011 census.
That's a big chunk of votes.
It was a risky move for any chief minister to go against them.
So political sensitivity kept things quiet for a while.
It definitely played a role.
But something changed, right?
Oh yeah, things shifted.
Was it public opinion?
Public opinion definitely had a part to play.
Okay.
But what really got the ball rolling was a legal challenge.
Someone took it to court.
Yep, in 2022, an advocate named Tambo Taman filed a public interest litigation.
PIL.
Exactly, with the Guwahati High Court.
And his argument was?
That the lack of those implementation rules was preventing the act from doing what it was supposed to do.
Which is?
Protecting indigenous faiths.
I see.
And the court agreed.
Really?
Oh, yeah. They ordered the Arunachal Pradesh government to come up with those missing rules.
And they gave them a deadline.
6 months.
Wow. So now the government had to act.
No more stalling.
Did this legal pressure line up with any changes in, like, cultural attitudes?
Definitely there were folks like Maya Murdam, who
Right.
was a strong advocate for repealing the act,
And she argued
that it was crucial for safeguarding traditional practices.
because
She was concerned about the erosion of indigenous languages and rituals.
and conversions.
Right. She saw it as a threat to the social fabric of these communities.
So for her, the act was a way to hit the brakes on this cultural loss.
Exactly.
So it sounds like a mix of motivations,
Mhm.
legal, cultural, maybe even political.
It's a complicated web for sure.
But to really get this act, especially for our UPSC folks out there,
Yeah, they need to understand this.
we need to look at it within the Indian Constitution, right?
Absolutely. And that's where Article 25 comes in.
The one about freedom of conscience.
Exactly. It guarantees every Indian citizen the right to freely profess, practice, and propagate religion.
But doesn't that clash with the idea of an anti-conversion law?
It seems like a contradiction.
Yeah, how does the Indian legal system reconcile those two things?
Well, the Supreme Court had weighed in on this a few times.
Okay, and there's a landmark case that our UPSC folks should know about.
Definitely Revan Stanislaus versus State of Madhya Pradesh.
That one's a classic, always comes up.
For good reason, it's a cornerstone of this whole debate.
So what did the Supreme Court say?
They clarified that while Article 25 protects your right to choose your religion,
Huh?
it doesn't give you the right to force that choice on someone else.
So you can choose, but you can't make others choose.
Right. And they upheld the validity of anti-conversion laws.
But only under certain conditions.
Exactly as long as those laws were targeting forced or fraudulent conversions.
So not someone's genuine right to choose their faith.
Exactly.
So it's a delicate balance protecting individual choice, but also giving states the power to regulate conversions.
To prevent exploitation or coercion.
And now Arunachal Pradesh is trying to walk that tightrope with this revived act.
Right in the spotlight.
This is getting really interesting.
It's a complex issue with lots of layers.
Before we dive into the potential consequences of this act, let's take a moment for you, our listeners.
Take a breath. Absorb all this information.
And if you're finding this deep dive helpful,
Especially for your UPSC prep.
don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give us a like.
It really helps us reach more folks like you who are hungry for knowledge.
We'll be back in a flash to continue this exploration.
Stay tuned. Welcome back, everyone. So now that we've got a handle on what this act is all about and why it's suddenly back in the news,
Right, like after all these years.
let's dig into the really important stuff.
The juicy...
The potential impact. You
Yeah.
know, what could this mean for Arunachal Pradesh and maybe even for India as a whole?
Okay, so practically speaking, if this act is actually enforced now, after being dormant for so long, what are we looking at?
You know, what are the likely consequences?
This has got to be on the UPSC radar, right?
Oh, absolutely. This is textbook mains exam material.
Like, they could totally ask about
Like,
this.
analyze the socio-political ramifications of a law like this.
It's right up their alley.
One immediate concern is definitely increased tension between religious communities.
Because...
Well, as we mentioned, Christians are a significant part of the population in Arunachal Pradesh.
Right, over 30%.
And they've been pretty vocal against this act.
So enforcing it could create this feeling of being targeted.
Exactly like they're being singled out or marginalized.
And that kind of resentment, especially when it's tied to religion, that can be dangerous.
It can be a recipe for conflict.
We've seen that happen time and again, right?
All over India and globally, too.
So when we're thinking about potential consequences, we have to factor in the possibility of protests, legal challenges.
Even violence in a worst-case scenario.
That's a scary thought.
It's something policymakers need to consider. And yeah, UPSC aspirants, too. You need to be aware of these potential pitfalls.
It's like one state, one law, but the ripple effects could spread across the country.
Exactly.
Could this become a model for other states?
You know, the ones who are also worried about preserving indigenous cultures?
They might see this and think, hey, that's a good idea.
It's definitely possible. We've seen it before in India, where one state's legal framework becomes a blueprint for others.
Like a domino effect.
If Arunachal Pradesh successfully implements this act and it gains political support or is seen as achieving its goals, other states might follow suit.
So we could end up with a patchwork of anti-conversion laws all across India.
Each with its own little quirks and interpretations.
Talk about a legal maze.
That kind of fragmentation can lead to so much uncertainty and confusion.
Not just for religious groups, but for the legal system itself.
Think about the challenges of enforcement. How do you prove a conversion was forced?
Right, what's the threshold?
What even counts as enticement?
It's also subjective.
Wide open to interpretation, which raises concerns about bias and discrimination.
These are all things the UPSC could ask you to analyze.
Definitely fair game for the exam.
And then there's the potential impact on national politics.
Oh, yeah, this is a big one.
We know how sensitive this whole religious conversion issue is in India.
It's a powder keg.
Could this fan the flames of communal tensions?
Become a tool for political mobilization.
It's a real possibility.
And that's where you, as future civil servants, would need to be extra careful.
Walking on eggshells.
Understanding these laws, the history, the potential for misuse, it's all crucial for navigating this sensitive terrain.
So we've talked about the downsides, the anxieties, but what about the flip side?
Yeah, there are two sides to every coin.
The people who support this act, they must have their reasons right.
Of course they do, and for them it's not about suppressing religious freedom.
Okay, so what is it about then?
It's about protecting a way of life.
Their culture.
Exactly. They argue that this act is crucial for safeguarding the unique cultural tapestry of Arunachal Pradesh.
Okay, I see where they're coming from.
Think about it. The state have this incredible diversity of indigenous cultures, many with their own spiritual beliefs and practices that are interwoven with their daily lives.
So for them, it's about preserving those indigenous faiths, those traditions.
From what they see as a threat.
Conversion.
Right. They're worried about the erosion of indigenous languages, the disappearance of rituals, the weakening of community bonds that are tied to these ancient practices.
So it's about cultural survival.
In a way, yes, they want to ensure a level playing field for all faiths, including those that have been practiced in Arunachal Pradesh for centuries.
And they might point to the fact that many indigenous communities themselves have raised concerns about conversions.
Absolutely. They say it can be disruptive.
To their social fabric.
Yeah, it can lead to divisions within families and communities.
Create tension and a sense of loss.
Exactly.
So it's like two sides of the same coin, right?
It really is.
Opponents see the act as a potential threat to individual religious freedom.
While supporters see it as a necessary measure to protect vulnerable communities and their cultural heritage.
That's a clash of values, a really complex one.
And it's a clash that's happening not just in Arunachal Pradesh, but in various forms all over India and the world.
Speaking of the world, is there an international angle to this that our UPSC folks should be aware of?
That's a great question, and the answer is yes.
Because religious freedom and conversion, that's not just an Indian issue.
Not at all. It's a global conversation.
So how India handles this in Arunachal Pradesh,
People are watching.
other countries are taking notes,
Absolutely. It could set a precedent for better or worse.
influencing how other countries approach religious freedom and cultural rights.
It adds another layer of complexity to this whole story, something UPSC aspirants should be ready to discuss.
So much to think about.
It's a multifaceted issue.
We've explored the history, the legal stuff, the potential consequences, even the international implications of this seemingly local issue.
We've covered a lot of ground.
But there's still one piece missing, right?
That core question.
The elephant in the room.
What exactly is force when we're talking about conversion?
Right. The act mentions coercion, enticement, trickery.
But where do you draw the line?
What about social pressure?
Or the promise of a better life?
Do those count as force?
These are the questions that are keeping ethicists, legal scholars, and policymakers up at night.
It's not a simple answer.
Not at all. And it's something you, as potential civil servants, might have to grapple with someday.
Food for thought.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So let's take a moment, let that sink in, and when we come back, we'll wrap up this deep dive with some key takeaways and a final thought to leave you pondering.
Don't go anywhere, folks. And we're back for the home stretch of our deep dive into this Arunachal Pradesh Freedom of Religion Act.
Quite a journey, right?
Definitely untacked a lot.
Tons of info.
So for our listeners, especially those gearing up for the UPSC, let's break this down.
Yeah, give you some key takeaways.
The good stuff, the things that might just give you an edge in that exam.
Exactly.
So first and foremost,
This act, it really highlights that tension between individual religious freedom and the desire to preserve indigenous cultures.
like those two things are often at odds, right?
It's a classic case of competing rights and figuring out that balance.
Where's the middle ground?
That's the tricky part, and that's what the UPSC loves.
Yeah, they want to see you think critically.
Analyze those gray areas.
No easy answers.
Exactly.
It also reminds us that even the concept of religious freedom, it can be interpreted in different ways.
Oh, yeah. Depends on the context.
What's okay in one situation might not be okay in another.
Nuance is key.
Takeaway number 2. Remember that PIL,
The public interest litigation.
the one that got this whole ball rolling.
It's a great example of how powerful legal challenges can be.
Right, and the role of the judiciary in shaping policy.
One person with a solid legal argument can spark real change.
It's like a domino effect.
And this is a recurring theme in Indian polity.
Something you should definitely be ready to discuss in your UPSC answers.
For sure.
It also shows how intertwined legal battles are with social and cultural movements.
It's not just about the law itself.
It's about the emotions, the values.
People fighting for what they believe in.
Passionate stuff.
Definitely.
Okay, takeaway number 3. What happens in one corner of India can have ripple effects across the country.
And even internationally.
Arunachal Pradesh, how they handle this act. It could become a model for other states.
And the world is watching, too.
It's a case study in managing religious freedom and cultural rights. That connection between local and global, that's key for anyone wanting to join the Indian civil services.
Couldn't agree more.
And of course, on a national level, this whole thing could become a political powder keg.
Oh, yeah. Things could get heated.
Understanding the history, the legal details, the potential consequences, good and bad.
It's all ammunition for those UPSC questions.
Knowledge is power, right?
Absolutely.
All right, 4th and final takeaway. If there's one thing we want you to remember from this deep dive, it's the importance of nuanced thinking.
No easy answers here, folks.
You got to see all sides, weigh different arguments.
Understand that any solution is going to involve compromises.
It's about recognizing that complexity
Embracing the messiness.
and using your knowledge to navigate it thoughtfully.
That's what makes a good civil servant.
Right. It's about finding that sweet spot where individual rights are protected, but the community as a whole is also considered.
Balancing those scales with wisdom and foresight.
And as we wrap up, let's go back to that thought-provoking question we posed earlier.
The big one.
What is force when it comes to religious conversion?
Where do we draw the line?
Is it just physical coercion, or can it be more subtle?
Like social pressure or the promise of a better life?
Those are tough questions. No clear-cut answers.
And that's why your critical thinking comes in.
How do you define the line between genuine persuasion and undue influence?
Where does choice end and exploitation begin?
These are questions that will shape the future of religious freedom, not just in India.
But globally,
And as future leaders, policymakers, administrators, you might be the ones answering those questions.
heavy stuff.
So keep those brains working. Keep exploring different perspectives and keep those UPSC books close at hand.
Knowledge is your best weapon.
And hey, if you enjoyed this deep dive,
Make sure to subscribe to the deep dive for more explorations like this.
we're here to help you navigate the complexities of the world, one fascinating topic at a time.
Until next time,
Keep learning, keep growing, and keep those minds sharp.
we'll catch you on the next deep dive.